relationship care. Can everybody see the screen? Is it working?
Yep.
Good. All right. Okay. So what is attachment? Attachment is a close emotional bond between parents and children. It begins in utero. It affects relationships throughout the lifespan, and it changes over the lifespan. We usually think it looks like this or this, but it can just as easily be this or this. And it's very nice when it looks like this. So attachment theory was founded by an Englishman named John Bowlby in 1969. Until that point, behaviorism had dominated in psychology, and people regarded attachment as a learned process, like you get attached to the people who feed you. So Bowlby said lasting psychological connectedness between human beings was the definition of attachment. And his theory had three main components. One was proximity to caregivers. The second was flight to caregivers for safety and threat, or using the caregiver as a secure base to explore the world, knowing that someone would be there. And for Bowlby, children were born with an innate drive to attach to caregivers. So attachment theory says that attaching to a caregiver serves the purpose of providing safety and security so that the child will survive. It's an evolutionary adaptation. And responsive, available parents were thought to create a secure child. So how is attachment related to trauma? Trauma can disrupt attachment through loss of access to a parent, through substance abuse, incarceration, or death. Poor attachment can create trauma through loss of connection, but also good attachment relationships can be protective against trauma and can help repair disrupted attachment. All right, so Mary Ainsworth built on Bowlby's attachment theory and developed the so-called strange situation, which identified three types of attachment: secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure ambivalent or resistant, based on the toddler's responses to separations from and reunions with the caregiver in the second year of life. And then Maine in 1986 identified a fourth type, insecure disorganized. So this is a drawing of the four types of attachment in an infant. So the first one is what you want, and that is, depending on the figures, you'll see different figures, but somewhere between 60 and 70% of infants are securely attached. So there's insecure resistant. The child is, it's the arched back when you pick her up and, kind of pulling away. The insecure avoidant, the child is sitting close and but not totally involved. There's a little bit of space. And then disorganized is much more confused looking. The child has his back to the caregiver, but is very close. All right, so in secure attachment, the child believes the attachment figure will meet his or her needs. The child is able to use the attachment figure as a safe base to go out and explore. The child will turn to the attachment figure in distress. That's a very important feature. And the child experiences the caregiver as available, responsive, and helpful. The child may also be comforted by the stranger in the strange situation, but shows a clear preference for the caregiver. And on the caregiver's part, the adult is sensitive to the child's signals and responds appropriately to the child's needs. So insecure avoidant attachment is different. That child isn't able to share emotionally during play. You don't get that give and take. There's little emotion in the strange situation when the caregiver leaves or returns. There's low affect when the child is offered affection, and he or she treats strangers and caregivers similarly. There is not a preference for the caregiver. In insecure ambivalent, the child is not able to use the caregiver as a secure base. The child is upset when the caregiver leaves, but slow to warm up when the caregiver comes back. The child seeks contact, but at the same time angrily resists it. So here's a picture of a child who, is apparently being comforted, but cannot be soothed. Usually this is an anxious child who has received inconsistent caregiving. Sometimes she gets what she needs, but a lot of the time she doesn't. Okay, and here's disorganized or disoriented attachment, which is characterized by contradictory behavior patterns. There's an approach and a withdrawal at the same time. This is a risk factor for externalizing behaviors later or acting out, dissociation, kind of checking out, and PTSD. And this child lives a paradox. The attachment figure is both the cause of distress and the person to turn to in distress. So this is these shadow figures, kind of, they're good for reading the body. These descriptions, of course, are too small probably for you to read, but you can see kind of the stereotypical, 4-person, 2-child happy family on the left for secure.
Since this is such a new way of delivering instruction, we can create systems that are as consistent as possible. I think young people benefit from it as well as adults.
I couldn't quite hear all that comment. I'm glad if this is a good way of presenting. So ambivalent attachment, you see the, 2 parents together and the child is at some distance but facing the adults. In the avoidant, the child is kind of tripping away and paying no attention to the adults. And then disorganized, we get that back to the caregiver thing again. All right, so researcher Mary Main, who came up with that 4th style, realized that adults have their own styles of attachment carried over from childhood. She developed what is known as the adult attachment interview that identified these types in adults: secure, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and fearful avoidant. So it's clear, that these map to the childhood types. So secure in attachment in adults, the person has a positive view of self and of relationships. This person has greater life satisfaction and is equally comfortable with intimacy and independence. The dismissive avoidant type in adults, the person has a positive view of self, a negative view of the other. Tries to seem invulnerable and is as if he or she doesn't need other people. This person is apt to hide feelings and deal with rejection by distancing. So not much relationship going on here. Anxious preoccupied adults are a little different. They have a negative view of self, but a positive view of the other. They need a lot of approval and seek high levels of intimacy. They sometimes become over-dependent on an attachment figure, such as a romantic partner. They get emotionally dysregulated, worrying about, whether somebody is cheating on them or what they're doing when they're not in their sight. And often that emotional dysregulation is relieved only in the presence of the attachment figure. They tend to doubt their worth as people. And the fearful avoidant adult has contradictory feelings. They want emotional closeness, but are afraid of having it. They have trouble with trust. They don't seek intimacy as often as the anxious type. They deny their feelings and are uncomfortable expressing affection. All right, so we talked a lot last time in the trauma talk about regulation. The sequence is usually, you're regulated in utero and as a tiny child by your caregivers. Then there's co-regulation with other people as your social circle expands. And then you learn to self-regulate and kind of keep yourself in check on your own. It came up last time because trauma interferes with the capacity to regulate yourself, and that's what we see in the kids. They tend to be either hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. So psychologist Alan Shore refers to attachment theory as fundamentally a regulatory theory. Ideally, kids learn to regulate in the presence of a safe other, and that translates into self-regulation and secure attachment. So regulation begins in the womb, along with such things as food and shelter and temperature regulation and sensory stimulation. What's developing is emotional regulation. So Alan Shore also says our emotional brain is shaped by human relationships. This is literally true. The brain regions involved with emotion regulation are incomplete at birth and are molded through interactions with other people. Shore refers to this as right brain to right brain communication because it's in the right brain that emotional states are developed and regulated. So as you look at this slide, these neural connections demonstrate the laterality, the fact that it's the right brain and the deep in the limbic lobes where these relationships begin, and they are subconscious. There's not a verbal component in the early stages. So regulation takes place in the in-between space. It can be the site of injury, but it can also be the site of repair. So the neurobiology of attachment. A child's neural system is designed to support attachment. In the short term, it keeps the child in close proximity to the caregiver for safety and survival. But in the presence of trauma, the brain adapts differently with a bias toward threat. So this is a specialized biological system supporting infant attachment. It's paradoxical when the caregiver, who is supposed to be neurological differences in emotional brain regions. You know, I didn't put anything about this, but there's a researcher in Boston named Marty Teicher, and he studies when different types of trauma occur, and some types of trauma can lead to resilience. It's not all bad news. So people who have been through certain types of trauma are able to develop adaptations that strengthen them for other situations later on. So the message there is that the brain does remain plastic or pliable throughout the lifespan, and poor attachment can heal. I want the emphasis here to be on the positive and say that, you know, change is possible and you can corrective we went over this last time to some extent. This is the impact of complex trauma, and that's what we refer to also as developmental trauma. It's not single incident. It's generally trauma that's occurred through a relationship that was a betrayal to a child to some extent. So this list, you might notice that everything on this list is about relationship. So the impact on attachment includes, this is a big one, uncertainty about the reliability and predictability of the world. Problems with boundaries, with trust. There's often social isolation, which is the opposite of what a person needs to heal. Interpersonal difficulties, trouble attuning to other people's emotional states, trouble taking the perspective of the other person, and a hard time enlisting other people as allies. And all of these things are pretty much the opposite. You need to be able to accept help and have social circles. And this is the sad thing, the lack of trust, because it's through relationship that attachment takes place and develops. All right. So
excuse me, I have a question.
Sure.
On that, this is Monica Robinson. So on the last slide you just had, what I see in that last slide is it's almost that the child lacks even a sense of empathy.
It can be that way. It's not inevitable, but that is one feature. And it's my point is that when it appears that way and you're maybe kind of disturbed by the child's behavior, the important thing there, to remember is that we can't prove this in children because you can't experiment, on children. But the hypothesis is that there's been a neurological absence, you have to have, a decent relationship, somebody paying attention and listening to develop empathy. But you are exactly right. Sometimes it appears that way in kids. And then in other kids, they go too far into somebody else's experience and over empathize and cry over, situations that really aren't theirs. So this can go a lot of ways. Yeah, thanks
Thank you.
for that. You're welcome. All right, so again, from last time, we talked about developmental trauma, and I'm repeating the definition, and you'll see what I'm pointing to. We define developmental trauma as the direct experience or witnessing of multiple or prolonged adverse events, and here's the key part, with significant disruptions of protective caregiving due to primary caregiver changes, separation, or emotional abuse. This is what can happen. And we talked about this last time. It's not inevitable that a child will develop trauma, even in the presence of these caregiver changes, etc. This is where kinship care comes in. Your care, you're paying attention, you're witnessing their experience, you're not denying and saying, oh, it wasn't that bad. You're being there. Your predictability and reliability are either preventive of this if you've had your child for a long time, or help in repairing developmental trauma. All right, so despite all of those things, children attached to their parents, research shows, and my experience in being on research teams with kids and talking to them, they never stop being, and you know this, they never stop worrying about their parents who are incarcerated or they're struggling with drugs. If there's a death, that's, a loss for all of you because these are family members. So regardless of quality of care, and even if their parents have been the source of abuse or neglect, children attached to their parents. And it's protective in the short term, but it can lead to difficulties later in the form of mental health issues as a child approaches adolescence. And that's when they need to be applauded for surviving and being so adaptive, but they also need to learn some new skills so they can have relationships and happier lives. All right, so repair is possible thanks to neuroplasticity. We can use neuroscience to heal attachment issues, because if we know where things go wrong, we have a clue to where they can be repaired. So this topic Angela brought up, and we talked about it a little bit last time. And I'd like to do that again this time to see what people's experiences are. There are loads of potential benefits to having birth parents involved in the kin family. There's great continuity for the children. They maintain emotional ties. It extends the family and gives more, resource people for the child. And regular structured contact means greater probability of the parents returning home. And this study said, especially if the contact is with the mother. There are tons of other factors here, such as how involved how involved the birth parents are, whether it's informal or formal placement. A big deal is what the relationship is like between the kinship carer and the birth parents. That's a huge factor for where the kids take their cues. I will say that everything I've read says that the vast majority of kids in the kinship families feel that they belong. They feel the sense of family even in the absence of their parents. So, these are some benefits. The drawbacks are obvious. It's just stressful for everybody. It's stressful for the child. It's stressful for the caregiver. Another comment? Did someone want to comment? Okay. So arranging visits is, we talked about this last time, and I will just be very pleased to have input from people. On a good day, it takes a ton of preparation, and kids need to know they're loved. Kids need to know they're loved. All right, so these were some suggestions posted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. This first one got us into trouble last time. They suggest maintaining a calendar so kids know when they will be getting together with their birth parents. So last time somebody said, you know, that's a great idea, but my child's parent always promises that he'll come and he doesn't show up, and it's so much harder. So having a calendar reminder would be a terrible idea. So with any of these, you know your situation far better than I do, or anybody in the American Academy of Pediatrics, or anybody else. So use your judgment. These are guidelines, and the basic thing is, you know, preparation, seeking support, and knowing your child and yourself. All right, so another suggestion was carrying in, you know, if the child is going, this is designed as if you're going out to meet the birth parent. If, you know, someone's coming in your home, that's obviously kind of a reverse situation, but a child can use a transitional object, like a, you know, just something developmentally appropriate. If they're little, a stuffed animal is good. If they're adolescent, something, I mean, I was thinking a rubber band on the wrist, you know, that they could like flick and be reminded, you know, like when I do this, I know somebody's there for me at home, and when I go back, everything will be okay. You know, help a child make a gift. These are the big ones. Reassure the child you'll be there when the visit is over. And if you are going out somewhere, if you're able to take them and pick them up, that's a good idea. You know, these are some things that I've read, but I imagine you have your own ideas for setting up visits. So these are good ways to promote good attachment, whatever has taken place before a child comes into your care. So emphasize safety and security, and provide stability as best you can. Balance structure with flexibility. You know when saying no is a good idea, and you know, when maybe you could cut them some slack. Another thing is be mindful of your own attachment style. You know, most people are sort of combinations of things, and the majority of adults are well attached. Somewhere between 50 and 70% of adults have good attachment. So that's wonderful. If you're one of those people, you'll be in a good place to regulate your children. When there have been disruptions, you know, you may see some of yourself in those other types. So in dealing with your child, you know, think about the child style, but also your own, and where you're in line, and maybe notice that it takes a little extra effort where you're different. Yeah, so if you know yourself, it sets a good model of your child and gives you some awareness of how your emotional style interacts with theirs. So this comes from the sensory motor arousal regulation team, the group of practitioners I work for, from their book, Transforming Trauma. Ultimately, predictable support helps ground the child, while flexibility and approach supports change and growth in development. So both are needed, and good judgment and paying attention help with that. All right, researcher Colwyn Trevarthen talks about rhythms of engagement for building attachment. So here's another quotation from Transforming Trauma that builds on Trevarthen's work. Attachment processes are built on natural rhythms of connection and disconnection, also known as call and response or serve and return. The steady repetition of rhythms of engagement lays down expectations of predictability and dependability. When a developing child experiences attunement from a caregiver, these processes become calming and reassuring. So that's my clock, if someone can hear that. It's not an actual bird. These activities help build attachment. And these are the physical things. Swinging and being swung by adults is fun. Rocking, anything that involves balance. Deep touch pressure, such as a big hug, if a child can tolerate it, or you know, diving under a heavy blanket and hiding out. Jumping and diving into sofa cushions or mattresses, not so good for your furniture. It works, these systems that we work with in SMART, the tactile and vestibular and proprioceptive systems, engaging all of those is regulating. And when you do them with your child, it naturally builds a bond. Right? Games that build attachment using the same principles are things like throwing a ball back and forth. There's reciprocity, it sets a rhythm, and you get a feeling of being in sync. And pretty soon, in the SMART room, over and over, we see kids just naturally start talking. It just kind of happens. And, you know, playing dodgeball, building a fort is play when he comes up. And the protection of the fort indicate that the child has a choice. All right, so this is one of my favorite frameworks for interventions for attachment. It's called ARC, Attachment, Regulation, and Competency. This link will take you to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for some information about ARC. You know, I did turn up one provider in Ohio, in Columbus. I turned up a few in Ohio, and I turned up one in Columbus, but I want to talk to Angela about it, because while I got the resource from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, I have some questions about their methods. So I'm hoping to collaborate with Angela to give you a good tip sheet, because people asked last time about therapy. This is a depiction of the building blocks of ARC. My point in showing you this is to notice that the bottom layer is attachment. Everything else is built on top of that. And I'm promoting this probably too much, but what I like about this is, about ARC, is that it's intergenerational. And often when there's trauma in one generation, there's been trauma in others. So this framework, everybody participates. So it gives you an opportunity to heal at a larger, on a larger scale. All right, here are some other resources I found. The first two are in Ohio. And as I said last time, I'm not familiar with options for youth in Central Ohio, but you use the ARC framework. And there's also the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio. Circle of Security advertises itself as focusing on relationships. I think that's worth pursuing. I meant to go back to this and put up the good tip sheets. I do like this website, but you have to search a little. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything here specific to kinship care, but they have good advice. These are marvelous. The Serve and Return Guide and Keys to Babies' Brain Development. The first is from, what's it called? Well, yeah, Center for Developing Child at Harvard. It is just full of good stuff. I highly recommend poking around their website. And what is this? American Association of, it's science, it's foot, I can't remember. But these are excellent. And the serve and return aspect is that, that reciprocity, it's learning, give and take, and the rhythm of relationship. Here's some more resources. These are more suggestions for visitations. You can take those or leave them. You'd probably be able to write your own. This sheet on coordinating with caseworkers, I thought might be helpful. I don't know how many people have caseworkers, but my understanding is that, working with, whether you're an informal or a formal placement, it just takes some of the pressure off to have some structure and to have some people to run interference, particularly with a parent who's still using, yeah. Okay, these are great. The top one, the ARC, the attachment regulation and competency, is just a short clip that kind of tells you how ARC developed. I highly recommend the Smart at Home series. These are fun things you can do in the house that engage those sensory systems that lead to regulation, and they're just kind of silly and fun too. Here are the takeaways. Accentuate the positive. Remember that your child's brain may be biased toward the negative, and calling attention to the positive promotes balance. It brings the child into the present moment. And if a child is able to kind of reframe things in the present moment as more positive and not focus so much on what's gone wrong in the past, it addresses the brain regions that allow for seeing a sense of self across time. You know, having the awareness that we're in now, you know, this is now, and things are okay now. And connection heals. Be there, say you're there, and show you're there. And I hate to say it takes a village, but it takes a village. The larger your social network, not only the better for you, but the better the outcome for the kids in your care. All right, so thank you. And